I watched Nolan Reed walk Avery Kingsley to her door after a quiet evening, meaning to leave before anyone noticed him, and then the mansion opened too soon. Conrad Kingsley, the man who owned a financial empire, stood in the great hall among his guests and saw his daughter holding the hand of a single father with no title and no fortune. The room waited for him to erupt. Conrad crossed the marble, looked Nolan over from his boots to his eyes, and told his butler to bring down a locked box. When the lid lifted, nobody in that hall dared speak. If you love reversals that leave arrogant men speechless, subscribe to the channel and stay to the last line. 3 months before that night, I watched the whole thing begin in a place nobody would have called glamorous, a community center on the east side of the city with a leaking roof and a foundation that had been quietly sinking for 11 years. The Kingsley Foundation had funded its restoration, and the contract, small enough that most builders in the region ignored the bid entirely, went to a company called Reed Restoration. Nolan Reed was 39 years old, a widower, the owner of that company, and the kind of man who still showed up at the site at 6 in the morning with a coffee in one hand and a moisture meter in the other. He had 18 employees, a truck with 240,000 miles on it, and a reputation among the older tradesmen for never signing his name to work he could not defend. He was not poor. He was simply ordinary in a way that certain people treat as a diagnosis. The first time Avery walked onto that site, she was wearing boots that had clearly been bought that morning, and Nolan assumed she was an intern sent to photograph progress for a donor letter. She introduced herself as Avery, project lead for community initiatives, and he shook her hand without asking for a surname, because on a job site a surname is rarely useful and almost never interesting. What interested him was that she asked about the joists. Not the ribbon cutting, not the timeline for the press release, the joists, and whether the east wall would hold once they opened it up. He answered her honestly, told her the wall was worse than the survey suggested, and watched her write it down instead of flinching. I remember thinking that neither of them understood yet what that small moment would eventually cost them both. 2 weeks in, a subcontractor named Del Rooker pulled Nolan aside behind the dumpsters and made him the kind of offer that gets made on nearly every publicly funded project in America. There were line items in the budget priced at roughly 4 times what the work was worth, and Del suggested that Nolan simply sign off on them, take a comfortable cut, and let the paperwork sort itself out the way paperwork always did. He explained it patiently, the way a man explains a thing he believes everyone already knows. He said the foundation had more money than sense, that nobody counted, and that the only people who ever got hurt were the ones who insisted on counting. He put a hand on Nolan's shoulder as if they were already partners in something. Nolan did not raise his voice. He did not threaten to report anyone, and he did not deliver a speech about integrity because, in my experience, the men who deliver those speeches are usually rehearsing an alibi. He removed Del's hand from his shoulder, looked at the drainage trench they were standing over, and said that in 4 years the ceiling in that gymnasium would come down on a room full of children, and that when it did, the only signature on the inspection sheet would be his own. He said he would not put his name on something he already knew was false. Then he went back to work. Avery was standing 30 feet away by the scaffolding, holding a folder she had forgotten to open, and she had heard all of it. His phone rang an hour later, and I saw his whole posture change, the shoulders dropping half an inch, the voice going warmer by 2 degrees. It was the after-school program calling about Sadie, his daughter, who was 7 and had decided that afternoon that she absolutely could not go home without the reading log she had left in her cubby. He said he would be there by 5:20, and he was, because in the 6 years since his wife died, he had missed exactly 4 pickups and could still name all 4. Avery noticed the change in him and said nothing about it, which he appreciated more than sympathy. She simply asked whether he had time to walk her through the cost sheet the next morning. He said he would, and that night, at his kitchen table, after Sadie was asleep, he opened the file and started running the numbers himself. He expected to find a few $1,000s of padding, the ordinary grease of an ordinary job. What he found instead, 3 hours later, with a cold cup of coffee at his elbow and a legal pad covered in his own cramped handwriting, was over $1 million moving through vendors he had never heard of, companies with clean names and no equipment, no crews, no history, no reason to exist except to receive money and pass it somewhere else. He did not call Avery that night, and he did not call a lawyer, and he certainly did not call any of the 3 people he knew who would have told him to keep his mouth shut and finish the job. He wrote a report. It took him 11 days, and he built it the way he built everything, slowly, with documentation for every claim, invoices matched against delivery records matched against the actual materials sitting on the site, which in 4 cases did not exist at all. Then he filed it through the Foundation's compliance channel exactly as the contract instructed, without copying anyone he thought might reward him for it. He did not ask for a finder's fee. He did not use the leverage to renegotiate his own contract upward, which any reasonable person in his position would have done, and which I fully expected him to do. Avery started spending more time at the site after that, and I would like to say it was purely professional oversight. But I saw the way she rearranged her calendar. They fell into the rhythm of people who work near each other and slowly stop pretending they are only working. They talked about ordinary things, the kind that never appear in the profiles of powerful families. About the year, Reed Restoration nearly folded, and Nolan sold his wife's car to make payroll. About the community garden project Avery had championed at 26 that failed spectacularly, because she had trusted a board member who was stealing from it. She told him she had learned more from that failure than from every success afterward. He told her that was the only reliable way anyone learns anything. What she liked, and she admitted this to herself long before she admitted it to him, was that he never once asked what she earned or who she knew. Every man she had dated since she was 22 had performed a certain calculation within the first hour, sometimes so smoothly she only recognized it in retrospect, a quiet inventory of what she might be worth to him. Nolan asked her whether she had eaten. He asked whether the foundation was going to fund the second phase, or leave the building half-finished the way donors so often did. He argued with her about the budget for the roof and lost, and then he did it her way without sulking about it, which she found unreasonably attractive. There was no grand romance in it, which is precisely why I believed in it. There was a dinner at a place with paper napkins, where they stayed 2 hours past closing because the owner liked them. There were 4 or 5 nights when he drove her home, and they sat in the truck outside her building talking about her mother, who had died when Avery was 19, and about Sadie, who had recently informed her father that she intended to become either a marine biologist or a person who owns a horse. There was one evening in early autumn when Avery leaned across the console and kissed him, and he did not pretend to be surprised. They were both adults with histories. Neither of them was looking for rescue. Then, on a Thursday, a foundation email came through on a thread about permit filings, and Nolan read the signature block twice. Avery Kingsley, Director of Community Initiatives. He sat in his office above the equipment yard for a long time with the screen glowing at him. He was not a man who followed the financial press closely, but nobody in that city could avoid the name, not with it stamped on the tower downtown and the hospital wing and the scholarship program every high school counselor mentioned. Conrad Kingsley's only daughter. He thought about the community center, and the audit report he had filed, and the fact that she had been standing 30 feet away when he refused Del Rooker's offer. He was not angry that she was wealthy. I want to be precise about that, because a lesser man would have been, and the story would have been smaller. He was angry that she had let him talk for 3 months without correcting the record, that she had watched him build something honest on a foundation she knew was incomplete. When he asked her about it that Friday, he did not shout. He asked why, and he waited, and she told him the truth, which was that people who learn her surname change within minutes, sometimes within seconds, and that she had wanted, exactly once in her adult life, to be known before she was priced. He understood that. He told her he understood it, and then he told her the harder part, which was that he needed time to work out whether he was dating Avery or whether he was walking into a world he had no interest in belonging to. He said his life was small on purpose. He said he had built it around a 7-year-old who had already lost one parent to circumstances beyond anyone's control, and that he would not casually attach that child to a family whose decisions were made in boardrooms. He was not being noble. He was being accurate about his limits, and I respected him for saying it out loud instead of simply disappearing, which is what most men do. She asked him the question 3 nights later, in the same truck, in the same parking lot, with the new roof finally on and the security lights humming above them. She asked it without preamble, the way she did everything, because she had learned young that the answers people give when they are unprepared are the only ones worth having. "If my father finds out about us," she said, "are you going to walk away?" Nolan looked straight ahead through the windshield at the building he had spent 3 months saving. He did not answer right away, and the silence lasted long enough that both of them knew the answer was going to be complicated. To understand what Nolan was hesitating about, you have to understand the world he was being invited into, and I had been watching that world for a very long time. Conrad Kingsley was 64 years old and had built Kingsley Capital Group out of a rented office and a line of credit his own father refused to co-sign. He owned a house on 11 acres north of the city with a great hall that could hold 300 people, and he had, over 4 decades, developed the particular stillness of a man who has never once had to repeat himself. That was the thing outsiders misread about him. They expected shouting. They expected the red-faced tyrant of the movies. Conrad did not shout. He asked a question in a level voice and then waited, and in that waiting, careers ended. I watched him sit through a presentation once entirely silent for 40 minutes, and by the end, the presenting executive had voluntarily withdrawn a proposal he had spent 2 years developing. One sentence from Conrad at the right dinner could move $100 million, and everyone in that hall knew it, which is why the hall was always full. He had inherited nothing and trusted almost no one, and he had constructed an entire philosophy out of a single conviction, which was that every person who approached his family wanted something, and that the only variable was how long they would wait before asking. Preston Ashbourne was 40, and he was everything Conrad had been trained by his own life to respect. Third-generation finance. A family that had been quietly wealthy since the 1890s, an education that cost more than most houses, and a board seat at a firm that had done business with Kingsley Capital for 11 years. He had the manners of someone who had never in his life waited for anything. More importantly, the Ashbourne family and Kingsley Capital were 4 months into negotiating a joint infrastructure fund worth roughly $600 million, a deal that would take 18 months to close and would make both families measurably richer. The financial press had been pairing Preston and Avery for 3 years in the light gossipy way that press does, and Preston had never bothered to correct any of it. He referred to her, at dinners, as though a decision had been made somewhere above both of them and was simply awaiting execution. He touched the small of her back when they were photographed together. He told a table of 11 people once, with Avery sitting 3 seats away, that she would come around eventually because women of her position always did, and he said it warmly, as a compliment. Avery had left that dinner early. She had spent the drive home shaking with a rage she could not explain to anyone, because on paper nothing had happened. Meanwhile, something else was moving through Conrad's building. The foundation's internal audit, triggered by a compliance filing in September, had escalated twice in 6 weeks. The preliminary findings crossed Conrad's desk in a plain folder, and what he read there did not resemble ordinary padding. It resembled architecture. Someone had built a structure of shell vendors specifically designed to survive a casual review, and someone with real influence had placed the general contractor who fed them. Conrad read it 3 times. At the top of the file, in the section listing the origin of the complaint, was a name he did not recognize. 2 weeks later, at the end of a Sunday dinner where almost nothing had been said, Conrad set down his glass and told his daughter that the annual gala was on the 9th. He mentioned the guest list. He mentioned that the Ashbournes would attend. Then he said, in the same level voice he used for everything, that if there was a man in her life, she should bring him. Avery understood exactly what she had been handed. It was not an invitation and it was not a peace offering. It was an examination, scheduled at a time and place of her father's choosing, in a room built entirely to his advantage. Nolan did not want to go, and he said so plainly, 3 times, over 2 weeks. He said the only thing worse than being underestimated was being displayed. Avery told him she was finished hiding him, that hiding him had been a kindness that had curdled into an insult, and that she would rather lose the argument in public than keep winning it in private. So on the 9th of November he put on the best suit he owned, a charcoal 2-button he had bought 4 years earlier for a funeral and worn twice since, and he drove north with his hands at 10 and 2, and Sadie stayed with his sister and made him promise to describe the desserts. The house did not announce itself from the road. That was the first thing he understood about real money, that it hides behind a 1/4 mile of oak trees and a gate with no name on it. Inside, the great hall opened 2 stories to a coffered ceiling, and there were roughly 200 people in it, and every one of them had been dressed by someone whose entire profession was dressing them. Nolan's suit was clean and pressed, and 11 years out of conversation with the room. He was aware of it within 90 seconds, in the way a man becomes aware of a stone in his boot, and then he decided, deliberately, to stop being aware of it. Preston came across the floor with a smile that had been engineered rather than felt. He introduced himself warmly, shook Nolan's hand with exactly the right pressure, and asked what field he worked in, and I want to note that at that moment Preston genuinely did not know, and was therefore genuinely pleasant. Nolan said he ran a company that restored and repaired older buildings. He named it. He said they were finishing a community center on the east side. Something behind Preston's eyes performed a rapid calculation, and the warmth did not leave his face so much as get repurposed, the way a room gets repurposed after someone dies in it. "Ah," Preston said, turning slightly so that 2 other men were drawn into the conversation without being invited. "You're the foundation's contractor." He said it the way you would introduce a caterer, and then he explained to the newcomers, helpfully, that Reed Restoration was handling the East Side property, and that Avery had been so involved with that project, so hands-on, that was just like her. Not Avery's partner, not a business owner, the contractor. It was done in under 9 seconds, and it was, I will admit, expertly executed. Nolan simply corrected the record, said he was there with Avery, and watched Preston absorb that with the mildest possible surprise, which was the cruelest available response. Then he arrived at the point he had been building toward from the beginning. Avery, he said fondly, had always had an enormous heart for causes. She got it from her mother. She had a habit of investing herself in projects that needed her, and it was one of her great qualities, though it did sometimes create confusion for the people on the receiving end. He looked at Nolan with something that was almost sympathy. "It must be difficult," he said, "to know whether one is being loved or being helped." Three people were now openly listening. I have rarely seen a knife slid in with such immaculate manners. Nolan did not reach for a defense, and he had one available. He could have named the $1 million he had traced and reported. He could have said that the company Preston was so amused by had turned down more money in one autumn than Preston had ever personally earned by his own effort. He did not, and I think that restraint was the most expensive thing he did all night. He set his glass on a passing tray, looked at Preston without heat, and said that he knew the difference between being helped and being respected, and that he had noticed only one of those being offered to him in that hall. Avery had crossed half the room by then. She had heard the last two sentences, and she did not perform outrage, because performing was Preston's language and she refused to speak it. She simply came to a stop beside Nolan and took his hand in front of 200 people in the middle of her father's house, and she did not let go. The nearest conversations died in stages, the way lights go out in an office building at night, and I watched the information move outward across that floor faster than any message could have carried it. Preston's smile stayed exactly where it was. It simply stopped meaning anything. Conrad had been on the staircase for some time. I do not know precisely how long, and neither did anyone else, which was characteristic. He had watched the introduction, the correction, the laughter, and the hand. He watched his daughter, 34 years old and the most careful person he knew, choose the least strategic possible moment to declare herself. He came down the stairs without hurrying. The hall reorganized itself around his movement the way iron filings reorganize around a magnet, and by the time he reached the floor, there was a clear path to where Nolan stood, and there was no sound in that house except a string quartet that nobody had told to stop. He stopped 4 feet away. He looked at Nolan for what felt like a very long time, taking in the suit, the shoes, the hands of a man who still worked with them. And then Conrad Kingsley said, in a voice pitched to carry no further than necessary, 2 words that changed the temperature of the room. Nolan Reed. It was not a question, and it was not a greeting. Nolan felt the shock go through him and did not show it, because he had never told this man his name, and this man had said it as though he had been saying it privately for weeks. Across the floor, Preston Ashbourne began to smile, believing the entertainment had finally begun. What followed, I have replayed more times than I can count, because everyone in that hall was watching the wrong man. Conrad asked 3 questions, and he asked them without raising his voice, and the quartet finally stopped playing somewhere in the middle of the second one. How long have you known my daughter? Nolan said 3 months. Did you know she was a Kingsley when you met her? Nolan said no, and that he had learned it 6 weeks in from an email signature, and that he had been angry about it for 2 days. A murmur went through the room at that, because nobody in that house had heard anyone admit to being angry with Avery in years. The third question was the one Conrad had been building toward since the file crossed his desk. Have you ever asked my daughter to help Reed Restoration secure additional contracts from the foundation or from anyone else? And Nolan, standing in a borrowed world in a 4-year-old suit with 200 people waiting for him to sweat, said no. Not a qualified no. Not a no with an explanatory clause attached to soften it. He said that he had a company he had built over 11 years, that it was not large and would never be large, and that he had never once discussed his contracts with Avery outside of the single project she oversaw. Preston stepped forward then, and this was his error, though he would not understand that for several more minutes. He said warmly, to the room rather than to Conrad, that surely they were all adults here. He said that a contractor dating the woman who controls Foundation's disbursements is not a romance. It is a business strategy, and that everyone present could do that arithmetic. Then he went further, because men like Preston always go further. He suggested that the convenient fraud allegations at the East Side project had eliminated a competing contractor and left Reed Restoration positioned for the second phase, and he asked, reasonably, who had benefited most from that discovery. Conrad turned to his butler, a man named Whitfield who had worked in that house for 22 years, and said, "Bring down the box from my study." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Whitfield went, and the wait was perhaps 90 seconds, and I have never heard 90 seconds sound like that. Preston was still standing forward from the crowd, having committed to his position, and he had the expression of a man who believes he has correctly predicted the ending. Avery's hand was white where it held Nolan's. The box came down, a locked document case in black leather, and Whitfield set it on the long table by the windows. Conrad opened it. There was no money in it, and no contract offering a single father a sum of money to disappear from a wealthy girl's life, which is what perhaps half the room expected and what a certain kind of story would have delivered. There was a document, bound, 406 pages, the completed forensic audit of the Kingsley Foundation's East Side Community Project, delivered to Conrad's desk 11 days earlier and read by exactly 4 people. He set it on the table, opened it to a tabbed page, and began, without any drama whatsoever, to read aloud the findings in the flat voice of a man reading a weather report. The vendors receiving the irregular payments, 9 of them, listed only 2 registered addresses between them, both traced upward through an intermediate holding structure to an investment vehicle called Halbrook Partners. Halbrook's controlling interest was held by the Ashbourne Family Trust, and its board included, since 2021, Preston Ashbourne personally. The general contractor who had brought those vendors onto the project had been recommended to the foundation, in writing, by Preston 8 months before the first invoice was ever submitted. Conrad read the recommendation letter aloud too. It took 11 seconds. It was the most devastating 11 seconds I have ever witnessed in a room full of powerful people. Then he turned to the section labeled Origin of Complaint, and he said the rest without reading it, because he had memorized it. The irregularities had been identified and reported by Nolan Reed on the 14th of September. That was 3 weeks before any relationship between Reed and his daughter had become anything other than professional, and 6 weeks before Reed learned her surname, a fact the Foundation's own correspondence log confirmed by timestamp. Reed had declined the whistleblower award, which in this case would have been $220,000, in a 2-sentence email stating that identifying a false invoice was not an achievement but a job requirement. Preston Ashbourne's face went the color of the tablecloth. Conrad closed the audit. Then he reached into the box a second time and removed a slimmer document, the preliminary agreement for the joint infrastructure fund between Kingsley Capital Group and the Ashbourne family interests, $600 million, 18 months of work, 41 people on 2 legal teams. He held it up so the room could see what it was, and a number of people in that hall recognized it instantly and made a sound I can only describe as involuntary. And Conrad Kingsley tore it in half down the middle, and then set the halves down neatly, squaring the edges the way a man does when he has no intention of ever picking them up again. He looked toward the 2 members of his security staff standing near the entry. Every person in that hall, without exception, believed he was about to have the contractor removed, because that is what that gesture had always meant in that house, and because the story they had been telling themselves all evening had only one available ending. Avery moved half a step in front of Nolan, and Conrad said, clearly enough for the back of the room, that Mr. Reed is not the man leaving this house tonight. Then he turned, unhurried, toward the man who had been so certain of his own position. Mr. Ashbourne is. I have never heard a room that size go so completely silent. Preston tried, briefly, to laugh, and it came out wrong, and then he tried to say something about his family and about 11 years of business, and Conrad did not respond to any of it, which was worse than any answer could have been. Preston walked out under his own power, with the security staff following at a respectful distance that fooled absolutely nobody, and the entire hall watched him go and then, very carefully, watched nothing at all. Somewhere near the bar, a woman set down her glass and it sounded like a gunshot. Conrad was not finished. He turned to his daughter, and for the first time all evening something moved in his face that was not calculation. He said that he had the right to decide who he did business with, and that he had exercised it, and that he would exercise it again. Then he said that he did not have the right to decide who she loved, that he had spent a great many years behaving as though he did, and that he had been wrong in a way that had cost him things he could not get back. Avery did not cry because Kingsleys do not, but it was a very near thing. Then Conrad Kingsley pulled out the chair beside his own at the head table, in front of 200 of the most consequential people in the state, and looked at the single father in the 4-year-old suit and said one word: "Sit." And Nolan Reed, who had walked into that house, fully prepared to be humiliated and leave, hesitated for a moment, and then sat down. That should have been the end of it. I thought it was the end of it. But at the far doors, before he stepped out into the cold, Preston Ashbourne turned and looked back across the hall at Nolan, and there was nothing defeated in that look at all. Men like Preston do not lose money and accept it. They lose money and then spend a great deal more of it, and what he could not take from Nolan by force he set about taking by narrative, which is cheaper and far more effective. Within 9 days, 3 business publications ran variations of the same item, sourced to people described only as individuals familiar with the matter. The story was not false in its facts, which is what made it lethal. It said that a small contractor had entered a relationship with the Kingsley heiress who oversaw his contract, that allegations he raised had removed a competing firm, and that the Ashbourne deal had collapsed immediately afterward. Every sentence was true. The arrangement of them was a lie, and there is no legal remedy for arrangement. By the 3rd week, a hospitality group that had used Reed Restoration for 6 years postponed a renovation indefinitely. A municipal historical board tabled a bid Nolan had spent 40 hours preparing. A supplier who had extended him terms for a decade asked, with genuine embarrassment, whether things were all right. 2 of his people had recruiters call them. A woman he had known since his first job asked him at a lumberyard, not unkindly, whether it was true that Kingsley was steering him work now, and Nolan realized the question would follow him for years. He could survive being looked down on. He had been looked down on his entire working life by men who had never carried anything heavier than a phone, and it had never once cost him a night of sleep. What he could not survive was the idea that Reed Restoration itself, 18 people, 11 years, a reputation built on 1,000 small refusals nobody had ever seen, would be remembered as something a man had been given because he was sleeping with the right woman. That was not pride. That was the only asset he actually owned. He told his foreman to decline the 2nd phase of the community project, and he pulled the company back from anything with the Kingsley name attached. Then he did the thing that nearly ended it. He told Avery, in her kitchen on a Tuesday night, that perhaps they should take some distance for a while. 6 months, he said, long enough for the story to die. He explained it carefully, the way he explained load calculations, laying out the damage and the timeline and the reasonable path forward. And he was so certain he was being selfless that it did not occur to him he was doing anything else. He said he would not have his daughter grow up. Hearing that her father had been bought, he said he was protecting all of them. Avery was angrier than I had ever seen her, and not for the reason he assumed. She said she did not care that he wanted to leave. People leave. She had survived that. What she could not tolerate was that he had made the decision alone and arrived to inform her of it, which was, in every meaningful respect, precisely what her father had been doing to her since she was 19. She said that if he walked away because of what a room full of people might think, then Preston Ashbourne had successfully made the most important decision of both their lives, from a distance, for free, and would be entitled to do it again whenever he felt like it. Nolan stood in that kitchen and understood that she was completely right, and that he had spent 6 years telling himself that unilateral decisions were a form of love because he had been making them alone for so long that he had forgotten there was another way. He did not apologize immediately, because he was not fast, but he stayed. They argued for another hour and then stopped arguing. He drove home at 1 in the morning and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes. And then he went inside and checked on his sleeping daughter, and he decided he was going to fix this rather than outlast it. Conrad, meanwhile, was under a pressure that he had not experienced in 19 years. The board of Kingsley Capital convened twice in 8 days. The collapse of the Ashbourne Fund had already cost $11 million in sunk cost and considerably more in confidence, and there were 6 directors who wanted it resurrected. Their proposal was elegant and completely reasonable in the way that only genuinely corrosive proposals are. Issue a statement distancing the foundation from any personal relationship. Suggest that the audit findings, while accurate, had been complicated by the reporter's proximity to the family. Ask Reed to step back quietly for a few months, then reopen talks with the Ashbournes on improved terms. Every part of it was survivable for everyone except one man, and that man had no seat at that table and no lawyer in that building and no way of even knowing the conversation was happening. Conrad listened to all of it without expression, which his directors had learned to read as consideration. Then he asked them a question. He asked which of them, in the last 10 years, had ever declined $220,000 for doing something correctly. Nobody answered. He said the meeting was over. Afterward, he sat alone in that room for some time, and I do not think he was thinking about money at all. He called Nolan the following week and asked him to come to the Kingsley Capital Tower, 41 floors above the city, and Nolan went because he had never in his life been afraid of a conversation. He was shown into an office larger than his entire operations building, with a view that made the community center invisible, and on the desk was a contract of 4 pages with a compensation figure on the second page that Nolan read twice to be certain of the number of digits. Conrad pushed it across the surface toward him with 2 fingers. "Sign it," he said, "and all of this goes away." Nolan read all 4 pages before he touched the pen, which is a thing almost nobody does, and while he read, Conrad watched him the way he had watched 1,000 negotiators, and learned more in those 6 minutes than the private file had told him in 6 weeks. Because the document was not what the room, or the board, or Preston Ashbourne, or anyone else would have assumed. It was not a payoff. It was not a settlement with a confidentiality clause and an exit. It was an offer to create a new position, independent contractor standards advisor to the Kingsley Foundation, reporting to no one, with authority to audit any project the foundation funded. Nolan finished page 4. He set the pen down on the desk, squared it against the edge of the contract, and pushed both back toward Conrad. Conrad asked why, and there was nothing hostile in it, only a genuine and rather rare curiosity. And Nolan said that if he took this position now, in this month, while those articles were still being forwarded around the city, then every single accusation Preston Ashbourne had made would instantly look like established fact. The contractor who reported fraud and was rewarded with a Kingsley salary. He said he would spend the rest of his career being that sentence. Conrad said that he could manage the perception, that he had done it before with larger problems, that a few phone calls would recalibrate the coverage within a month. And Nolan said no. And then he made the only request he made of that family in the entire course of this story. "Do not defend me with statements," he said. "Defend me with the record. Publish the full audit, unredacted. Publish the complete bidding history of the East Side project, every submission, every score, every recommendation, and who made it. Publish my company's numbers on that job as well, he said, including the parts that make me look worse. It took 4. The Kingsley Foundation convened an open session with its board, its major partners, its auditors, and for the first time in its 40-year history, the press. The full forensic report was distributed unredacted. The bidding records went out in a bound appendix that ran to 900 pages, and the record established, in a manner no rumor could survive, 3 things in sequence. First, that Nolan Reed had received no preferential treatment of any kind. His firm had won the original contract as the lowest of 4 qualified bidders, by a margin of $9,000. Second, that his report had been filed on the 14th of September, and that the Foundation's own correspondence log, time-stamped and independently verified, placed his first knowledge of Avery Kingsley's surname on the 27th of October. Third, and this was the detail that finished it, Reed Restoration had lost money on the East Side project, $91,000, because Nolan had refused to sign 4 change orders he knew to be fraudulent and had absorbed the schedule delays himself rather than pass them to a nonprofit. The auditors had confirmed it. He had never mentioned it to anyone, including Avery. Preston Ashbourne had nothing left to stand on. The recommendation letter was his signature. The trust structure was his family's. The board seat was his own. 2 of the 3 publications that had run the original item published corrections within 9 days, and the 3rd simply stopped writing about it, which in that world amounts to the same thing. The Ashbourne family withdrew formally from the infrastructure fund and issued a statement about strategic realignment that persuaded no one. Preston resigned his board seat in February. I am told he now spends most of the year abroad. At the end of that session, a director named Marion Halloway, who had sat on the Kingsley Foundation board for 19 years and had voted against nearly everything Conrad ever proposed, leaned toward the microphone and asked Nolan the question the entire room wanted answered. "What do you want from Kingsley, Mr. Reed?" And Nolan, who had been standing at that lectern for 40 minutes answering questions about invoices, said the simplest possible thing, which was nothing. Then he stopped and corrected himself because he had thought about this for 4 weeks, and he was not going to waste the only opportunity he would ever have. He said there was one thing. He said that on every publicly funded project he had ever worked, there came a moment when a small contractor was asked to choose between keeping the contract and keeping his principles, and that the reason so many of them chose wrong was not that they were dishonest, but that the system offered them no way to survive being honest. He proposed a disbursement structure with independent verification at each stage, a protected reporting channel that did not route through the project's own management, and payment terms that did not punish a firm for refusing a false invoice. The room was quiet in a completely different way than the great hall had been. Conrad Kingsley stood up at the head of that table, and everyone expected a summary or a motion. He did not call the man at the lectern the contractor. He did not call him his daughter's boyfriend. He said, "Mr. Reed," and he extended his hand across 19 feet of polished walnut, and held it there until Nolan crossed the room and took it, and he shook it in front of his entire board, and that photograph, which nobody had planned, ran in more places than every rumor combined. Some weeks later, on a cold, bright Saturday in March, a single black car came up the east side and parked at the curb outside the finished community center. No convoy, no assistant, no photographer. Conrad Kingsley got out alone in a wool coat and stood on the sidewalk for a minute, looking up at a building he had funded and never once visited. Inside, Nolan was on a ladder in the gymnasium checking the last of the ceiling anchors because the punch list was his and he had never delegated a punch list in 11 years. He came down the ladder and the 2 men looked at each other across the empty floor. They talked for a long time on folding chairs, in a room that smelled of new paint. Conrad said, without preamble, that for 19 years he had believed that protecting his daughter and controlling everyone who came near her were the same activity, and that he had defended that belief so successfully that it had cost him most of what he had actually wanted from her. He said his wife had told him so, at the end, and he had not listened. He said he was aware that he was 64 and that this was rather late in the schedule for this particular discovery. Nolan laughed, briefly, and said that the honest answer was that he did not balance it, that anyone who claimed to balance it was managing an image rather than a household. He said there were weeks the company won, and weeks Sadie won, and that he had made the wrong call more times than he could stand to count. All he tried to do, he said, was make sure that every single time he chose the work, his daughter still ended that day, knowing she mattered more than the work did. He said, "You cannot always give a child your time, but you can never let her doubt her ranking." Conrad Kingsley, who had $4 billion and a daughter who had spent 15 years choosing her words carefully around him, sat in a folding chair in an empty gymnasium and said nothing at all for some time. I watched a man perform an accounting he had avoided for 2 decades. There was no dramatic reconciliation afterward, no tearful reunion, because that is not how men like Conrad operate. He simply began calling Avery on Sundays and listening more than he spoke, and after about 4 months, she stopped being surprised by it. Nothing else transformed overnight, and I want to be honest about that, because the satisfying version of this story would have ended somewhere else. Nolan and Avery did not marry that spring. Conrad did not write a check that made a small business into an empire, and Nolan would have refused it if he had. Reed Restoration grew the way it had always grown, one referral at a time, and by the following winter it had 26 employees and a second truck and a slightly less alarming amount of debt. Avery and Nolan simply stopped hiding, went to dinners together, argued about roofing, and let the city adjust. The Kingsley Foundation adopted the disbursement standards more or less as Nolan had outlined them, and 11 other regional foundations copied the framework within 2 years, and no article ever mentioned who wrote it, which suited him perfectly. Sadie turned 8, remained committed to marine biology, and met Avery in the ordinary way, slowly, over several months of nothing in particular, which is the only way that ever works. Conrad met her once, at a hardware store of all places, and reportedly spent 19 minutes discussing sharks with complete seriousness. At a small foundation event the following autumn, a new partner from out of state stood beside Conrad Kingsley with a glass in his hand and nodded toward the far end of the room, where Avery was laughing at something, and a man in a plain gray jacket was deep in conversation with 3 contractors about drainage. "Who is that?" the man asked. "The one standing with your daughter." A year earlier, Conrad would have had an immediate and diminishing answer available. He looked across the room for a moment before he spoke, and something in his face had changed permanently. "Nolan Reed," he said. The man waited, the way people always wait, for the rest of it, for the firm and the title and the connection that would explain why such a person was standing in such a room. Conrad Kingsley let the silence go on exactly long enough. Then he smiled, which he did perhaps 4 times a year, and said that Mr. Reed had never needed the Kingsley name for anyone in a room to know precisely who he was, and across the floor, entirely unaware of any of it, the contractor went on talking about drainage.